Hello, and welcome to Universal Options 1.1. In this video, we will go over the new and exciting features in this update. So, let's get started by going into our documentation. As a revamp or as a refresh, in this blueprint you will find what's exposed to the general blueprints in terms of structs and functions that you can easily access, whether it is from the subsystem, the structs themselves, or just the functional libraries. Alright, so let's go over our project settings, and things have changed quite vastly. So first of all, we now have the option in global settings to enable or disable modules completely. So what this means is, say that your game does not need any of the sound settings controlled at the plugin level, you can simply just disable that, and when you open your game, even if you already had elements saved in it, for the sound profile, it will not apply any of this information. So that's an interesting little thing. In terms of graphics, we've added quite a little bit, and strike yourself on the right. First of all, we've added graphic type name and graphic quality name settings. In 1.0, there wasn't really a way to control this. It just simply handled them by the literal conversion of the enumeration. Now in this update, we have them availability in text, which means that you can localize them, and then for the widgets that we have, it'll fetch this option so that you can then really customize how you want things to be portrayed. Likewise, with new graphic settings and quality, that's up to you, and localization can take you in a lot of places. One of the other bigger updates in terms of graphics is that we now have the ability to auto detect and apply that. So essentially, to do that, you enable auto detect on profile. You select which of those profiles, and this is coming from your data table that you've defined here. So in this case, I have a custom profile, and then in my settings, my custom settings on initially are going to get loaded on the custom one. Here are your auto detect settings. It'll give the engine an idea of what you want to benchmark and how you want to benchmark things. And lastly, whenever you're in auto detect, do you want settings to be applied, and do you want even things to be to be applied, to be saved rather? Okay. Next, the other thing that we have in graphics profile, and that we have also in other sections of the plugin, is now a load-to configuration. So specifically to graphics, one of the annoying things that happened was that in 1.0, if you save a file and then you change your data table, you won't be able to access any of those options until you've deleted that save file. So with this new element here, you can choose how those elements get fetched. So for instance, let's say that I want my updates to always keep configuration. So in that sense, I just keep config, and it goes on that. Likewise, we have keep save values, which essentially just controls whether we overwrite these values or the saved ones. Additionally, this does not affect custom profiles, which means that if your user had a specific configuration that they had chosen themselves, this will not modify it, which means that whenever setting things up, just make sure that the profiles that you want to be kept to configuration are not set to custom. For more information on that, please refer to the documentations or the previous video. All right. Last but not least, the things that have been added to graphics profile has been the default graphic resolution and load window. Essentially, this allows you a bit more control over how your first launch goes. The window mode, as well as the type of resolution. Whether it was you want maximum, medium, 1 over maximum force value, or just a very specific standard resolution set that you want to apply. Okay, so moving on from graphic settings, we'll go into, I'll leave this one for later, we'll go into sound profiles. So like graphic settings, we have added now the configuration files, so how you want these settings to apply in case that you want to add new layers and the like. This had the same issue as graphics. So now with this, you can have a bit more control over what classes, in terms of layers, stay and move forward. Going to game settings, that's the only really major things that have changed as well, is that we now have control over graphics how our configurations get loaded. Additionally, for game settings, we have added a significant amount of fetch functions that now allow us to grab settings on bulk, and I think this will be really useful for building settings as well as for building widgets and the like. Okay, now onto the little, or rather big guy that I skipped a while ago. It's input, and the input is probably the biggest update, or the module that has the biggest updates in that. So I'll be going over one by one, and hopefully it'll go straightforward. The first big change that I'm going to introduce is we've added the ability, and let me just minimize this. We've added the ability to have cancellation keys. So in 1.0, the only way to really cancel something is by adding static keys. And the inconvenient thing about this is that it only looks into your action bindings, action or axis bindings, which means that in this case, if you have an input binding that is called escape, and then you run that, it won't be able to trigger it. But if you don't actually have that, and you want the escape key in your mouse, in your keyboard, sorry, to always cancel it, now you can specify this here. Another thing that we added was that we added the ability to have a bit more control over what can overwrite each. So in 1.0, you can only have the ability of whether allow things to replace each other between axis and actions, or not allow that at all. Now we allowed sections both just inside axis, or inside actions, or inside action and axis. Another thing that the plugin has now support for is that we now accept for game paths to be remapped, as well as for mouse keys to be remapped, which is a significant difference from previously. Okay, those are like the minor things. So strap on. As you might have noticed, we also have these data tables. Now, what do they do? I'm going to go over by the simplest one, and then we'll go from there. The first one that I'm going to go over is the binds text data asset. And what this does is that this allows us to set in a text configuration, which is of course localizable, a set of front-end names as well as categories. And I'll explain what I mean by this. So let's say that you want, for instance, that you want to organize your keys at the widget level by categories, or that you want them to be a different name from what the actual input binding is. This allows you to have control over that, and this looks for both in axis bindings and action bindings. And I'll go over the category a little bit later, but just to mention that it is something that you can use. Secondly, and one of the other biggest changes that we have in here is that we now have layout configurations. And before going into this a little bit too deep, this allows you that for a given configuration to set which keys are allowed to even participate. So let's say that in a keyboard game, you only want your letters to be rebindable, and you don't want the option for the user to be able to rebind the number letters, or to not be able to allow the number pad to be active. In this case, you would go to layout configuration, which allows you to have multiple elements based on name, and you can also have different settings for each of them. And then in here you can check both what keys are accepted, and also what are their display features. So what I mean by this is that in 1.0, at least for the default implementation, the only way to really display them is through the literal name of the key, and that's not particularly the best thing to do, or what you may desire. So in this case, per key you have a text configuration as well as a texture file in case you want to use gamepad keys, or you have a specific keyboard layout at the image level. This is where you can set that up. Now, of course, as in the previous image, you can have as many configurations as you want, and the way that you link them is that inside your project setting, inside your profiles, you will see that we have now added a visual configuration name, and this is pointing towards that layout. So in this case, I'm going towards the default, and it's going to look for the default configuration, which is in this case, my keyboard layout in terms of the input. Okay, last but not least, another thing that wasn't particularly the best in 1.0 is that you didn't really have the ability to switch between entire keyboard layouts. And what I mean by this is that you had as many inputs as you want, but you can't really test different things out, because you would have to modify this entire thing, and it's not really solvable. So what we added is we have added the way to be able to set up your entire input component settings at the data asset level, so that then if you do need to, you can easily switch out entire configurations. Now, in case you already had things set up at this default, the default configuration settings, if you're not pointing to any active data asset, it will take your settings as a priority. So just keeping that in mind. Okay, so those are the general, settings changes. Another thing that input has made a huge difference are two things. The first one is that we now detect controller paths, and what I mean by that is, if we go down to our documentation, is that we can now detect controller changes. So when a controller is detected or undetected in case that they disconnect it. So if you want to just query them or sections, you can simply access those elements. And if you want to be able to set up something every time a world is initialized or whenever there's a change, you can also bind that to a delegate and take it out from there. As an example, let's say that whenever a player connects their PlayStation controller, you want the entire input profile to switch from set 1 to set 3. In that case, what you would do is you would hook this this delegate up. It'll check the data. If it finds a place, you can query that that result, and then if it finds a PlayStation section, switch that profile, and you can do something like that. Okay. All right. Now going into probably the second biggest section of this update is that now, unlike 1.0, we now offer an entire set of widgets at the C++ level, which means that in order to make your implementation, the only real thing that you have to do is inherit from this class and do a couple of minor configurations. Plus the fact that if you want to use our base one, the visuals have been greatly revamped and it's a lot more pleasant to work with now. So just to quickly show you kind of what some of the differences are like, I'm going to start by quickly playing, and then I'll trigger that. And then in the menu, you'll see that you have now V1 and V2, and this will give you an idea of what things look like, at least in terms of 1.0. Not particularly the most optimal and or reusable things to do, versus 1.1, which is a bit more organized, a bit more focused on like the minimalistic setting, but that is still visually pleasant to look at, as well as of course much more options. Now, also talking about imports, the other thing that I didn't talk about was that you now have the ability to rebind things manually. So in 1.1, you only had the ability to listen to active, open gates, and now you have the ability to actually manually set your configuration so that, if you have a specific menu or if you have a specific layer that you want to choose from, you want to give a player your user, if you're working especially if you're working more in a production environment, this is the way to go. So for instance, let's say we're going to go to my set 1 and I want to remap this, and I wanted to use control, so I'm going to go to enter, and I want this to use both left control and shift, and it'll see that, and you'll see how my update has sections. As always, from the 1.0 update, you can always check your changes and discard and see it'll set to whatever was the last accepted configuration. Okay. All right, so far so good. So let's go a little bit into the widgets, what you have to do, how are they different, and essentially what can you expect from this new system. Let's start by I suppose the simplest section, and that is the audio and the slot. Essentially, the audio page, which is what controls all of these elements and generates all of them, is now a procedural process, which essentially means that instead of actually having to spawn anything, at designer time, the only thing you need to do is set a class, in this case if you want your specific implementation, and then set a given configuration that you want to use in order to actually show things. So if we open our audio slot, it's a very simple process, and that essentially has a couple of functions just at the design level, and then a couple of overrides. This is a theme that is used throughout the rest of the layers. So if you go into something like game settings, instead of having quite honestly the monstrosity that the other one had, and I'll show you what I mean by in a little bit, and let's go to game. Instead of having something like this, which is not particularly easy to set up, now you have the ability to just go into, let's say, on our heroes, and then just have a couple of functions that simply just check what a value is, and everything else is handled for you. Now for each of these, you'll notice that I split them into two. So now each page of settings is now its own given widget. It gives you a little bit more control and freedom in terms of like modularity, what you want to add. Each one has the ability to listen to one profile. So going back into our settings from 1.0, you have that in our profile gameplay, we have a given set of settings, and this is what the widget is listening to. So it's listening to gameplay, and these are the values that it is allowed to modify. All right. In terms of that, then we have a collection of pages, in which case we have, the settings page, and this is for the most part just multiple settings pages together, and then just a couple of functions just for actually, switching them so that everyone knows what's going on. Okay. Moving on, we're going to go onto the graphics element of things. So we go to graphics. It's again a much more simplified system now. The bottom sections, in terms of like the settings element. So if we go here, everything below the auto detect is now generated procedurally, and like audio, it's just something that you have to set up in terms of a class, and then which settings you want to do. Just a little note on this: global does represent the entire profile change, and what I mean by that is the following. So in this case, global represents this top bar, and then all of the others are essentially a window slot. In terms of references and what this mirrors, this generally mirrors the structure of widgets in 1.0, but of course aims to implement them a lot better and a lot more modular, especially a way that you can actually implement it without having to recreate everything from scratch, which was something that unfortunately 1.0 had. Okay, last but not least, we have our input, and then here you can see that we have all of our data asset sections. We also have a couple of utility widgets, which is actually like really nice. We have our set input text. So in this case, you can select your given bind text, and then it'll run it, and then it'll try to autofill it based on whatever you have on your current input section at the time. So if I have this here, it'll fill it with this information. Likewise, we have this other one which allows you to set up, to fill sub-layout configurations, and based on the entire map of sets that the engine accepts, which one can make it to go through. Okay, in terms of general sections, window slot and window key are relatively straightforward. Like its previous, sections are very simple widgets in terms, require just a couple of hooks set up. The one that probably requires the most amount of work is the input window, and this is because this handles both the listen gate and the section gate. The process itself is relatively simple, but just keep in mind that this one does require a little bit more setup. For more details, of course, you can check the documentation, and it'll give you a much more detailed overview of how the system works. So, which is what I'm going to be going over now. The general section in terms of how to navigate the documents is that, generally speaking, they have been vastly extended, and I'll be brushing over a couple of things that you can check into right now. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. The major change at the subsystem level is that things have been cleaned up a lot in terms of both a couple of bugs that were present in 1.0, as well as just the navigation's a little bit more pleasant to deal with now. And of course, the biggest changes would be at the widget level. So if you want to, of course, check all of the updates at a technical level, you can check up these individual elements. If you're interested in the widget setup, of course, you can redirect yourself to page 24 and then take it from there. The first section explains how the C++ classes work and how they all talk to each other. And then you have the blueprint setup, which goes over one by one how you should be setting up the classes. Some of those settings we already went through in this video, but the documentation will go into it significantly further, as well as take you step by step what you need to do. And finally, but not least, we have our changelogs, and this is just kind of like a very rundown summary of everything that has come in the update, as well as the bug fixes. If you happen to find anything, feel free to reach me out, and I'll try to solve your issues as quickly as possible. That's it for me. I hope you enjoy this update. It's been very exciting to work with it, and have a good day. Take care.